Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Jared Cohen and Elise Jordan. Thanks for joining us. FAN's
Thanks so
YouTube
much.
channel has an archive of over 300 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some short, brief introductions, because they have very long resumes. Jared Cohen is the president of Global Affairs and co-head of the Office of Applied Innovation at Goldman Sachs. Prior to joining the firm, he was chief executive officer at Jigsaw, which he founded at Alphabet Inc. in 2016. Previously, Jared was Google's first director of ideas and chief advisor to Google's chief executive officer and executive chairman, Eric Schmidt. From 2006 to 2010, he served as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff and as a close advisor to both Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton. We've hosted one of the two of them. Jared is the author of several New York Times bestselling books, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Financial Times, and Foreign Policy, and probably about a dozen more. Elise Jordan, his conversation partner, is a communications strategist, writer, and political analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. Her forthcoming history of General Dwight D. Eisenhower and the women who worked for him during World War II will be published by Knopf in 2025. Elise was a policy and communications advisor to Senator Rand Paul's 2016 presidential campaign, and during the George W. Bush administration, she worked in the White House Office of Presidential Speechwriting and at the State Department as a speechwriter to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. That's twice. Her work has been featured in numerous publications, including Time, The Atlantic, Wall Street Journal, BuzzFeed, Marie Claire, and National Review. And now let's welcome Jared Cohen and Elise Jordan.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to do this, and I think as Lonnie alluded to, Jared and I overlapped at the State Department when we worked for Secretary Rice and in the policy planning office. Jared as an advisor and focusing on digital and youth in the Middle East, I believe. Do you think, is that a correct way of? But you had an expansive portfolio. And so now I'm so happy to be here to talk to him about his awesome new book. And congratulations, Jared.
Thank you, Elise. It's great to be here. And we have known each other a long time. We kind of spent our 20s being raised by the State Department. So we've come full circle.
Definitely. So let's just start out. This is going to be about Jared's New York Times bestseller. I believe it's several weeks now, Life After Power, 7 Presidents and Their Search for Purpose Beyond the White House. Congratulations, because you already have gotten some rave reviews. David Garrow, who won Pulitzer Prize for his bio of Martin Luther King, and he said, all in, Life After Power is a richly rewarding and thought-provoking read. So that's pretty high praise, Jared. And then another one that I really loved was in the Wall Street Journal from Richard Smith, who called you a member of the rising generation of presidential historians, the literary junior varsity. And he really seemed to get, Richard Smith, just how obsessed you are with presidential history. You named one of your daughters, her middle name is Garfield. You have this expansive collection that you used to keep in your office and in your home of presidential memorabilia and all of your pictures with famous world leaders, because you've met everyone and have probably half of their cell phones on your cell phone. But what of your collection, just to start out on a totally random note, what's the weirdest piece of memorabilia you have, or the one that you value the most?
So it's a great question. I think it's important to set this context, because I sit at Goldman Sachs, and here we are talking about a work of presidential history, and it's been the most consistent thread in my life, is this sort of obsession with U.S. presidents. And it's when I'm 90 years old, hopefully I live that long, I'll still be writing about presidential history. I have 12 different locks of presidential hair on display in my home, and it's important to remind the audience that in the 19th century and earlier, people didn't ask for autographs, so they would write letters to the president asking them to snip a lock of their hair and attach it with wax to the paper, and then the president would sign it, and they would get rid of the autograph and keep the hair. So I have all those locks of hair going back to George Washington, but I also have the vial of poison where after James Garfield was assassinated by Charles Guiteau, his assassin was captured and brought to prison, and his sister sent him a vial of poison so that he could take his own life and spare the hanging. And we know that he did not consume that poison, and instead he was hanged because the poison is sitting on a very high shelf in my library because I have 3 small kids.
I'm glad of that. So this, I wanted to kind of give this context just so your readers know that this is a true passion for you. And not only have you been a practitioner of politics and policy, but this is just something that you love and you've studied deeply. And now you've written yet another best-selling book. And you have another presidential history that called Accidental Presidents, and you profile 8 presidents in that too, who ended up in office accidentally. And so this is kind of a pattern in keeping with accidental presidents, that you're not focusing on just one president and one bio and one political moment. You're focusing on a big idea. And so how do you get your idea when you settle on what you're going to dedicate, half a decade to?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting, think about a book. I think there's only 2 reasons to write a book. You have something you want to say, and you want to say it before somebody else. And I strongly advise people not to do that, because you're racing against the clock. You're sort of writing it, for the wrong reasons. The real reason to write a book is there's a question that you want to grapple with, a hobby you want to dig into, and you need to justify spending time on it. And for me, look, you have 45 men that have served as president 46 times, because Cleveland did it twice. And most of them are completely lost in the annals of history. They're footnotes in history. One part of the reason I like delving into presidential history, it's very humbling for the rest of us, because none of us are going to be president. And if people rose to the presidency and then are forgotten, it kind of jostles you back to the present, and gets you really kind of, recalibrating the way you think about ambition and making sure that the life that you're, living isn't sacrificed in service of something that you're not even going to be around to see. But the other thing that I like, all these presidents whose names we've forgotten, they become secondary characters in a much more interesting chapter of history. And so when I write these history books, it's a combination. The last one, Accidental Presidents, looked at what happened the 8 times in history that a US president died in office. And each of these stories had been told individually, but they'd never been pieced together. And what I was really interested in is, the founding fathers had reflected very little on this question of, presidential succession due to death in office. And I was interested in kind of how that evolved over time. What I realized in writing that book, which was prescriptive for Life After Power, is it spans the full arc of American history, from the 1840s all the way to JFK's assassination in 1963. And I sort of determined after that I like telling America's story through the lens of a group biography and using a different organizing principle for each. And so the idea for Life After Power, because I've always been sort of fascinated by this elusive question of what do we do next, right? I'm a sort of hyperactive, extroverted, kind of ambitious person. And like so many people who would describe themselves in that similar way, you feel almost burdened by this obsessive need to always answer that question. You start a new job and the people around you already want to know what you're doing next. And I thought, you know what? I've seen case studies with CEOs. I've seen case studies with athletes. But what about the most dramatic transition in the world, from leader of the free world, president of the United States, to just an ordinary citizen? And I wanted to understand if any of them managed to eclipse the presidency with something of greater meaning and purpose. And it occurred to me, you sort of read these thick Ron Chernow biographies and you kind of close the book for the last 50 pages where it talks about the post-presidency. And to be honest with you, when I embarked on this journey and I sold the book to Simon & Schuster, I wasn't sure if the post-presidency had any elements of it that were worth writing about. And, I picked 7 presidents because frankly, there were really only 7 that were worth writing about. And by happenstance, it starts with Thomas Jefferson, who was a lifelong founder, and finishes up with George W. Bush, who has really figured out how to completely move on. And among the active living presidents, he's the one whose popularity has doubled, yet he's invested less in his legacy and his reputation than any of his active contemporaries. And so again, I find myself telling America's story, but this time through the story of the post-presidency or the ex-presidency. And, we forget that when the founding fathers architected the republic, they didn't really have good examples for the peaceful transfer of power. And so the very idea of an ex-president, it's a feature of a democracy, not a bug. Authoritarian systems, they don't have the luxury of ex-presidents. Their ex-presidents are either in prison or suffer some other ill fate. But the founders, they were running from monarchy. They were trying to build the anti-monarchy, and they did sort of worry about this question of what to do with ex-presidents, and they debated it. When they were sort of drafting the Constitution, and they had all kinds of clever ideas. But it was Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 72 who asked the question, does it promote the stability and the well-being of the republic to basically have half a dozen men wandering around the rest of us like discontented ghosts? And more than 200 years later, I think we kind of have an answer to Hamilton's question, which is they can either be partners to their successors, or they can be their successors' most formidable adversaries, and everything in between. But we basically kind of winged it on how we manage the post-presidency. And we've seen everything from an ex-president defect from the Union and become a traitor, and be denied a state funeral. That was John Tyler in 1862, to the 7 presidents that I focus on in this book.
And that's a great segue for what I wanted to do. I thought we could go through, since we do have the luxury of this, hour-long window, we could go through each president and why you pick specific presidents. It's 7, as you mentioned. So, and one thing you said in the book was you compared former presidents to former astronauts. And I thought that was a really succinct way of talking about just this literally otherworldly experience that they have. And then boom, it's just over. So let's start with the first president in your book, Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd presidency. And he began post-presidency around 1809. And he was the first president to really accomplish something great in the aftermath. And you write that for Thomas Jefferson, the University of Virginia was, quote, more important to Jefferson than the presidency, and he always knew it would be. And so can you talk about how Jefferson found meaning in creating the University of Virginia?
Yeah, so the way the book is architected is, I feature 7 presidents, and each of the 7 presidents is an archetype for a different model for how to answer the question of what's next. So as you kind of delve into the book, it's meant so that you can either go straight to the model that you most relate to, or maybe you read the entire thing and you figure out it's different pieces of these stories that tie together. And so the Jefferson chapter is called The Lifelong Founder. So anyone who thinks of themselves as a serial entrepreneur or a serial founder, Jefferson's story is quite informative because, he wrote his own, epitaph. And it didn't include being president. It included being author of the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, and the founder of the University of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson viewed his life as a 3-volume trilogy, and he accomplished the first 2 volumes before he was president. Again, the Declaration of Independence and Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. But he was a co-founder of the Republic, and he understood full well that they built a republic that was deeply flawed. And if they didn't create something that he sort of saw as an arts and sciences university to train the next generation, to iterate on the flaws that they had left behind and improve the republic for the next generation, then the United States wouldn't survive. And he agonized over this. He was burdened by this. He was overwhelmed by this. The problem is, like anybody who found something, he was saddled with several founders' obligations, right? So he, had to be Secretary of State. He had to be vice president. Then he had to be president not once, but twice. He tried to retire from public life on 3 separate occasions. He found out he was Secretary of State after declining the job and George Washington announcing that he had named him as Secretary of State. And so, he lost a lot of time with this sort of set of founders' obligations. So when he finally leaves office in 1809, Jefferson knows exactly what he wants to do, which is found this university. And this is a man who lived to be 83 years old. right? He dies in 1826. It's remarkable to think of living that long at that time. It far exceeds the life expectancy. And I'll tell an anecdote, which I think really kind of captures the essence of the story, and it's very relevant to what we see playing out on university campuses today. So October 4th, 1825 was the worst day in Thomas Jefferson's life by far. They had just sort of opened the doors to the inaugural class of the University of Virginia. He was the rector of the university. He had personally architected and designed the university from the curriculum to the buildings. And on that particular day, several dozen students in that inaugural class covered their faces with face masks, which is kind of the 1825 equivalent of anonymity on social media, and they stormed and rioted through his university, chanting "Down with European professors." They filled bags with urine and threw them as kind of, I guess, the equivalent of Molotov cocktails at professors. They beat a professor senseless with his cane, leaving him kind of bloodied and humiliated. And Jefferson is watching this, and the third volume of his life trilogy is being torn up before his very eyes. And so he's emotionally distraught about this. He literally thinks that the end of the Republic has happened right there on his college campus. So the next day, Thomas Jefferson calls all of the students to meet before the disciplinary committee of the University of Virginia. The disciplinary committee on October 5th, 1825 of the University of Virginia consisted of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, the most intimidating disciplinary committee, past, present, or future, of any university. I mean, my brother-in-law was in a fraternity at Stanford when Condi Rice was the vice provost. Thought that was intimidating. This is much more intimidating. And so Jefferson, none of the guilty students would confess in sort of a weird show of Southern honor. And Jefferson stands up to address the students, and he goes to speak. And at 82 years old, by the way, you'll see a picture in the book. I used generative AI to create a photograph of what Thomas Jefferson would have looked like at 82 years old. And I did this for a very specific reason, which is I go into detail about how as he goes to speak and address these students, he's bawling, tears dripping down his cheeks. He can't muster the strength to articulate words, to form sentences, and even chastise the students. And he's so emotionally distraught. And James Madison, who is all of 5'1", puts his hand on Jefferson's shoulder and gestures him to sit down. And then Madison himself stands up, and before he can utter a single word, these students who deeply admired Thomas Jefferson, they'd all been privy to dinners around his table, listening to his stories of the founding. They were so distraught by seeing a man they so greatly admired, who exuded such extraordinary principle and conviction, brought to tears by their very actions, that one by one, the guilty students confessed. And the ringleader of it ended up being a guy named Wilson Carey, who was his great nephew, which was like the ultimate sting. The story has a happy ending, which is obviously, the University of Virginia survives. Thomas Jefferson remains the only ex-president to create an institution that's lasted more than 200 years, which is an extraordinary achievement. But I think that there's an important lesson in this, which is you look at university campuses today, and there's a difference between leaders who are stewards and managers of a university and leaders who lead through principle and conviction. And Jefferson led with principle and conviction and authority. And that's why in 1825, the inauguration of the University of Virginia, which was really an underdog, there was a lot of headwinds that stood in Jefferson's way. It succeeded because it was led by a man of principle.
Thomas Jefferson, the founder. I like it. So then the second president that you profile, John Quincy Adams, the sixth president, son of a former president, was a one-termer, finished in 1829, and he was so angry about his loss that he didn't go to Andrew Jackson's inauguration, right? And he just skipped home, went home to Quincy, Massachusetts. And so he's 61 years old. He's a one-termer, not so happy, but he wasn't done. And he had an incredible second act that had conviction, important seismic conviction for the sake of moving our country in the right direction, when he joined the House of Representatives and became an abolitionist. And can you talk about John Quincy Adams? And because I found your portrayal of his transformation just to be fascinating.
So this might be my favorite. When you read the book, I think you'll come away feeling like this. I think authors can't resist the urge to reveal their favorite chapters.
I think it was my favorite.
And this was by far, delving into his story was a really special experience. And this chapter is called The Second Act. And what I should say also, there's actually, each of these presidents answered the question of what's next in a very different way. The one thing they all had in common is they either went into the post-presidency knowing what they were deeply principled about and doubled down on that, or they discovered something that they were deeply principled about in the post-presidency. Now, as you mentioned, Elise, John Quincy Adams' presidency was an intermission between two of the greatest acts in American history, and they were very different. His first act was architected for him top down by his famous parents, John and Abigail Adams, and it was an act designed to make, a second generation from the founding president of the United States. And Adams had been Secretary of State, he'd been a senator, he'd served as ambassador to every major court that you could imagine. I mean, the only thing he hadn't done is serve as president. And he, in 1824, the election gets thrown to the House of Representatives. And John Quincy Adams strikes what gets called or labeled the corrupt bargain with Henry Clay, where Henry Clay basically, gets Secretary of State, and John Quincy Adams gets the presidency. The consequence of that is his presidency was basically a political stillborn. And there's this story that I tell that comes out of his diaries, where a year into his presidency, his agenda is stifled. He's basically spending his time breeding silkworms on the White House lawn. He can't get anything in his agenda done. His reputation's in tatters. And so he decides to go with his valet to swim in a tributary in the Potomac. So they take a boat out, and it's a particularly windy and rough day. And Adams is so he's in very kind of heavy gear, and the boat capsizes. And Adams gets so weighed down by his heavy clothes that he nearly drowns and dies. He's basically treading water for, roughly, 2+ hours. And he finally gets rescued, and both Adams and his valet end up stripping down completely naked. And so imagine this, right? It's 1825, and the president of the United States and his valet are buck naked in a horse and buggy carriage, trotting their way back to the White House. And so Adams doesn't even bother to put his clothes back on. He's drenched and naked and sort of sitting there shivering in the White House. And he sort of is reflecting and acknowledges that this whole thing is just an eerie metaphor for the humiliation that is his presidency. And so he gets defeated for re-election in 1828, and he doesn't know what to do. He hates Andrew Jackson, as you mentioned. He boycotts the inauguration, and he goes back to Quincy, Massachusetts, and he's just, he's lost. His diary is filled with sort of self-loathing, kind of torturous mental, diatribes. He tries to become a tree farmer. All of his trees die. He spends like dozens and dozens of pages on a weekly basis talking about how the dead trees are a metaphor for his life. He tries to write a biography on his father. He can't get through that. And, the only thing that he knows how to do is serve, because the first act of his life, it had no purpose other than the purpose imposed on him by his parents. And so some of the other citizens in Quincy, they convince him to stand for election for the House of Representatives. And he agrees to do it, and he gets elected to the House of Representatives, the only ex-president to ever serve in the House. And it's the lowest government position he's ever had. And he goes to the House, he doesn't really know what to do. Right. So he shows up, and what you would do in basically the early 1830s is petitions would get sent in, and you would read the petitions. So he starts reading these petitions, and some of them are petitions from abolitionists to abolish, the slave trade in Washington, D.C., to abolish slavery altogether. And so Adams reads them just as a matter of procedure. And then the reaction from the slaveocracy catches his attention, because you don't talk about slavery in the House in the 1830s. And so Adams gets his first sort of agitation here. And so he starts doing more of it. And the more petitions he reads from abolitionists, the angrier the slaveocracy gets. The angrier the slaveocracy gets, the more he does it, the more he's willing to do it, the more inundated he becomes with petitions. And so he's very principled about this idea of free speech and the freedom to petition. And that's what it starts as. he rejects the notion that he's an abolitionist, right? Back then, it's hard to imagine, in the 1830s, abolitionism, even for people like him that abhorred the institution of slavery, was a very fringy, radical, disorganized movement that had no coherence. What happens next, as he's reading these petitions, Congress, the House basically decides to pass a formal rule gagging slavery. Like you can't, becomes a formal rule that you can't talk about slavery. And then Adams, who was so much smarter than other members of the House, and when you read the chapter, you'll see all the clever and creative ways that he just outfoxes and outmaneuvers the slaveocracy in Congress. And I won't spoil some of it, but it's I never thought legislative history could be so interesting, but it shows you a time where Congress was like savvy and exciting and brilliance won out over kind of emotion and agitation, and merit won. And so you'll enjoy reading how he sort of zigged and zagged throughout the slaveocracy to kind of outmaneuver them. To sort of close out this part of the story, Adams serves 9 terms in the House of Representatives. And this is a man who got his first job appointed by George Washington to serve in his administration. And he dies on the House floor in 1848, serving alongside a freshman congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. So he becomes this living connection between, multiple generations. By the end of Adams' tenure in the House, he kind of owns and embraces the fact that he's an abolitionist. And as an abolitionist, he achieved something he never achieved as, a president, as a secretary of state, and as a political figure before that, which is he was popular. And he was revered, and crowds came out to see him. Even his enemies revered him. They called him Old Man Eloquent. They said, I despise the ground that man walks on, but I never want to face him in battle ever again. And by the way, back then, people pulled guns on each other in Congress and beat each other up in Congress. And Adams was protected by the fact that he was so old that nobody dare punch him or hit him with anything. But Adams, in this much lower station, found a much higher calling, and he takes this fringe radical movement of abolitionism and he mainstreams it probably a decade before it was ready, and he hands the baton and the torch to Abraham Lincoln. We have no actual accounts of their interaction in Congress, but we know that Abraham Lincoln greatly admired John Quincy Adams, and we know that he took his intellectual the intellectual building blocks that led him to a thesis around emancipation through amendment from some of what he saw John Quincy Adams argue for in the House of Representatives. And the reason I love this story and the reason I love this model is we always assume in a next act, or we often assume in a next act or a second act, that we have a cause in mind and then we pursue that cause relentlessly. What Adams teaches us, and what you'll find in this chapter, is if you submit yourself and are sort of vulnerable and allow yourself to sort of exist in a set of circumstances that makes you kind of open-minded and flexible, that cause that you never imagined may end up finding you. And I found that very inspiring.
No, it's a beautiful, beautiful story. The next president was Grover Cleveland, 22nd and 24th president. And so he was the first Democrat elected after the Civil War. And he, so far, maybe not for long, was the only president to come back for a second term and to have that break after losing. And so you said it turns out, quote, it turns out former presidents are bad at running for president. But Cleveland, like Donald Trump maybe, was the exception. So can you talk a little bit about what we can learn from Grover Cleveland's tenure and his return to power, and how you think that might inform how we look at Donald Trump's second term?
Yeah. So as a preface to this, I mean, when you start writing these books, I'm 42 now. I started writing this book in my 30s. You just never know, what's going to tie to the news. And I never could have imagined that we would have an excuse to talk about Grover Cleveland and have it actually be relevant to the current moment. But 2024 is going to feature the only rematch between two presidents in American history other than 1892, when Grover Cleveland came back to challenge incumbent Benjamin Harrison. And by the way, other than that comparison, the analogy actually, the two examples actually have very little in common. this chapter is called The Comeback, not surprisingly. But Grover Cleveland never lost the popular vote. And he threw away the presidency in 1888 on principle, and he didn't want to come back. And so I'll come back to the comparison with 2024. But my view is it shows you how kind of off script our political evolution is going. The founding fathers, they would not have wanted to have the only other time than 1892 be like in 2024. That they would have had an allergic reaction to that. But it's true. I do say that former presidents have. This isn't. Grover Cleveland wasn't the first. Former president to try to make a comeback, nor was Donald Trump the second. You had Martin Van Buren in 1836 try to make a comeback as a free soiler. He never gained traction. Millard Fillmore, who I'm sure everybody on this call spends a ton of time thinking about, tried to come back in 1856 as a know-nothing. He gained very little traction. Ulysses Grant tried for a non-consecutive third term in 1880. He lost on the 34th ballot at the Republican National Convention to James Garfield, who was not running for president, and in fact was the campaign manager for Governor Sherman of Ohio, who was running third in the ballot count. But somebody chanted, "We want Garfield," and he ended up accidentally getting a nomination that he neither sought nor wanted. Theodore Roosevelt ran as a bull, ditched the Republican Party in 1912, ran as a bull moose, and got, didn't just split the Republican vote, but William Howard Taft, the incumbent, only carried a single state, and he handed Woodrow Wilson, the presidency. And then you've had a number of others kind of contemplate a comeback, like Hoover in 36 and 40, and obviously, Donald Trump in 2024. The reason I wrote about Grover Cleveland is comebacks are easy to contemplate. They're much harder to consummate. And when they're successful, they're rarely as sweet the second time around. And I thought Cleveland's story was a cautionary tale. To start with, Cleveland's meteoric rise was perhaps unmatched in American history. In 3 years, he went from mayor of Buffalo to governor of New York to president of the United States. And what accelerated his path was at a time of machine politics and spoilsmen. Grover Cleveland was known for his honesty and his integrity. And so he enters the White House in 1884, as you mentioned, the first Democrat elected since James Buchanan in 1856. And when he's up for re-election in 1888, the big issue is the tariff. And the machine politicians want a tariff hike, and Grover Cleveland doesn't want a tariff hike because he thinks the country doesn't need it and it's just going to fill the pockets of the bosses. And so he basically throws away the presidency in 1888 on that principle. And when he's challenged on it, he says, what is the point of being president if you're not going to stand for something? Now, he had also entered the presidency as a bachelor. So there was another reason he wanted to get out of office, which is he had fallen in love. Now, this is a story that sounds nice, but it actually won't age well as people dig into the details, which is Grover Cleveland's best friend and former law partner, a guy named Oscar Folsom, dies in a very 19th century accident, which is his horse and buggy collided with some other horse and buggy and killed him. And his daughter, Frances Cleveland, at 11 years old, became Grover Cleveland became her guardian, and she used to call him Uncle Cleve, and he was basically a father figure to her. In an inappropriate, twist of fate, he starts courting her romantically while she's a teenager, and then more seriously courting her when she's an undergraduate at Wells College, where he proposes to her, and she becomes she becomes the youngest first lady in American history at 21 years old. That will never be eclipsed. So all he wanted to do was leave the White House and start a family with her. So he spends his sort of first post-presidency enjoying life. They start having kids. But something starts to happen in the interregnum, which is the Harrison administration signs the first $1 billion budget. The growing tide of jingoism and imperialism makes him concerned about the trajectory of America. He's very anti-imperialist. There's a real heated debate over cheap money, meaning unlimited coinage of free silver versus sound money, adherence to the gold standard. And Cleveland is terrified that if the U.S. falls off the gold standard, it's the end of the economy and the end of the republic. And so Cleveland determines, and here's another similarity today, that he is the only Democrat capable of stemming the sort of unfortunate tide of what's to happen. And because he had never lost the popular vote, just the Electoral College, he remained very popular. And he won despite the protest of his own Democratic Party bosses. And from the time that he wins the election in November of 1892 to the time he takes office in March of 1893, the country changes. By the time he starts his second presidency, the country faces the worst economic depression in its history. American settlers have overthrown Queen Liliuokalani in Hawaii and threatened to annex the islands, and it's now irreversible. The debates over sort of cheap money versus sound money are heating up. And more importantly, Grover Cleveland moves his tongue to the top of his mouth and feels a lump and learns that he may have terminal cancer. And this was a big deal because the only thing Grover Cleveland ever did that basically leaned into dishonesty was when he hid his cancer from the American people. And the reason he did it is the country had just gone through a very public, Ulysses Grant's very public battle with cancer, and it wasn't very well understood. And Cleveland had to call a special session of Congress. And he was worried that if the country knew he had cancer and it could be terminal, that the depression would be exacerbated. And so he sort of lied for the good of the Republic. Anyway, fast forward, Cleveland leaves office the second time in 1897. He's never been more unhappy. He's never been heavier. He's never been more unhealthy. And he's never regretted being president more than his tenure as the 24th president of the United States. And finally, when he's asked in his second post-presidency what America should do with ex-presidents, he said they should be taken out back to a 5-acre lot and shot to death. He then corrects himself and says, on second thought, a 5-acre lot is far too big for an ex-president. And in any event, an ex-president has already suffered too much.
Oh, that was a little self-loathing, but yes. We'll move on to your fourth example, Howard Taft, 27th president. He, to me, is really unique in that he just didn't really want to be president. And his second act for him was everything that he had always wanted and everything he'd always dreamed to contribute. So let's talk about Taft a bit.
So the William Howard Taft chapter is called A Dream Deferred. So for anybody who's ever passed up an opportunity or not pursued an opportunity because the timing wasn't right, the circumstances weren't right, the William Howard Taft chapter will be instructive for you. So William Howard Taft, from the time he was a young boy, was deeply principled about what he wanted and had very strong conviction about what his dream was, which is he wanted to be a justice on the Supreme Court and, if possible, Chief Justice. The problem is the level of conviction he had about what he cared about, he didn't carry over to the decisions he made in his career. His wife, Nellie Taft, as a teenager, went to visit President Hayes and told President Hayes that because she was a woman, she could never be president, but she was going to do the next best thing and marry a president. And Hayes joked with her, I hope he's an Ohio man. And it's amazing. Nellie Taft married a president, and he was from Ohio. So good on her. The problem that William Howard Taft had is he loved his wife, and she wanted him to be president. He loved his brothers, and they wanted him to be president. And he loved Theodore Roosevelt, who was his friend and mentor, who wanted him to be president. And he basically outsourced his entire career at the expense of his own ambitions to that court of family and friends who were basically trying to manufacture a president. So he turns down the Supreme Court 3 times. He's offered it 3 times by Theodore Roosevelt, and he turns it down each time. And there's a great story where his son, is asked while Taft is serving as Secretary of War. There's sort of still this question of, is Taft going to accept the third offer to serve on the Supreme Court, which would be a Chief Justice position, or is he going to run for president? And his son basically, tells this reporter that the die has been cast. Ma wants him to be president. And so he goes on to be elected president as Theodore Roosevelt's successor. All the reasons that made him eventually a great judge and had made him a great judge are all the reasons he was a terrible president. He didn't make executive decisions. He was a consensus builder. He liked to deliberate. He liked process. He was not decisive. And so Theodore Roosevelt, I'm not sure there was anything you could have done to keep him from wanting to come back. So when Theodore Roosevelt comes back in 1910 and then challenges Taft in 1912, it breaks their friendship. And I should mention, by the way, Nellie Taft, who wanted her husband to be president more than anything, less than a year into their time in the White House, she has a stroke that nearly kills her. And that just adds to the melancholy. So Taft does something so Taft, as president, by the way, appoints 6 justices to the Supreme Court, including a chief justice. It's more than any other president in a single term, past or present. He does something very interesting, which is he has an opportunity to appoint a chief justice, and he can choose between an old man and a young man. And he chooses an old man. And his thinking behind this was, if he ever gets a shot at the court, he's much more likely to get the chief justice position, with that person in the seat. And he believes he has an understanding with Chief Justice White that should the opportunity ever arise, the Chief Justice would step down and Taft would take his place. So fast forward to 1920, and Warren Harding gets elected president and tells Taft that he wants to put him on the court. The problem is the Chief Justice position isn't available. And because Taft had appointed all these other justices, he believes that he can't take any position other than a Chief Justice. So he goes to kind of collect on the agreement he had with the Chief Justice, only to find that the Chief Justice, who's both blind and deaf and in terrible health, is unwilling to give up the position. He dies a month later, and Taft ends up as Chief Justice.
Some things never change.
Some things never change. So Taft, in his last decade of life, he serves as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It's the happiest decade of his entire life. And at the very end, he's asked the question what he enjoyed more, being president or being Chief Justice. And he says, I hardly remember I was ever president. He's the only president to serve at the top of 2 of the 3 branches of government. And the lesson in the Taft story is that a dream deferred can still be a dream achieved, and a dream deferred need not be a dream denied.
Good lesson. The 5th president, and I'm so glad that you feature him, you did Herbert Hoover. He was the 31st president, and we all know he, 1929, stock market collapsed. He got blamed for the Great Depression and everything and left, and he was hugely unpopular and became, in common memory, more remembered about Hoovervilles than what he previously had been remembered by, and that was as the great humanitarian. And Margaret Hoover is a good mutual friend of both of us. She's the great granddaughter of Herbert Hoover, and she has been trying to reshape the narrative around what she feels has been unfair, and I think has been unfair, blaming Hoover for the Great Depression and not giving him credit for some of the really amazing things you did. Like you point out that he probably saved, as a candidate, more lives than any other president. And in post-presidency, he really lived up to a new phrase, the great humanitarian.
So I'm on a mission to make Herbert Hoover great again, as we've discussed, and Margaret's on that crusade with me. This chapter is called Recovery, and it's a story for anybody who's lost what they once had and wants to recover it. And Herbert Hoover lived to be 90 years old, yet he's defined by 3.5 years in office during the Great Depression. He had one of the most extraordinary pre-presidencies and post-presidencies in American history. As you mentioned, Elise, here's a man who was, an orphan as a young age, rose to become a self-made millionaire, developed an extraordinary reputation as a great executive. He was the great humanitarian who fed Europe after World War I. He led famine relief in your home state of Mississippi after the great 1927 flood, aiding mostly an African-American population. And he was seen as a bipartisan figure. He was actually courted to run for president by both parties. And he basically waltzes into the White House in 1928 in one of the most lopsided victories in American history. And then the Great Depression happens. And in 1932, he loses his job, he loses his name, and more importantly, he loses the sort of status of great humanitarian. He loses his platform to be of service. And in the 12 years of FDR's presidency, they really do a number on him. I mean, such a number on him that as recently as a month ago, you have Donald Trump and Joe Biden debating who's more like Herbert Hoover, right? It's still all these years later. And the FDR presidency, it felt like the never-ending presidency. And I think, for Hoover, during those 12 years, he really wrestles between the vanity of wanting to recover his name and get his job back, and what he actually cares about, which is a being of service, right? And Arthur Brooks, the philosopher, has this concept of a need to be needed. Herbert Hoover was a man who needed to be needed. And when FDR dies on April 12th, 1945, and Harry Truman resurrects Herbert Hoover, he does so for a simple reason, which is World War II is raging, and they're confronting a massive famine, not just for Europe, but for the entire world. And there's only one man who knows what it's like to be president, and also what it's like, and also how to feed the world, and it's Herbert Hoover. And so he once again helps Herbert Hoover achieve this status as the great humanitarian, which he does. Herbert Hoover achieves his status again as a great executive, reorganizing the executive branch of government under both Truman and Eisenhower. And he achieves his status again as a bipartisan figure when in 1960, Joe Kennedy calls on him to reconcile the defeated Richard Nixon and JFK to show national unity. And there's a very important piece of Herbert Hoover's story, which is it's only in 1940, when he finally decides that he's going to retire from politics, that he unburdens himself from the sort of the motives of vanity that were wrapped up in trying to get the presidency back or recover his name, and he focuses just on what he actually cares about, which is being of a service. And I think that's a really powerful lesson for anybody on a recovery journey. And then my favorite quote from Herbert Hoover, when he leaves office, he talks about how democracy is a harsh employer.
Yes.
But in his late 80s, he gets asked the question, how did he deal with his critics all these years? Because there's no president who's been more of a punching bag than Herbert Hoover for as long as he has. And he has this very funny line, which is he said, look, I outlived the bastards. And so longevity was a big part of his success.
Let's move on to your sixth example, Jimmy Carter, 39th president, also a one-termer. And Jimmy Carter, really until he went into hospice earlier this year, had stayed active in the post-presidential circuit and the world stage in a way that, really there's just no comparison. And so could you talk about Carter, but also Carter wasn't without controversy. I mean, certainly Hoover had controversy, but the controversy about Hoover wasn't about the way he handled himself or carried himself post-presidency or any of the issues that he necessarily, got himself involved with. And, in Carter's case, presidents who were in office sometimes felt like he was meddling. So could you just kind of talk a little bit about Carter as the post-presidential example?
So this chapter is called The Former, and it's for anyone who wanted their greatest act to be permanent. And even if Carter had been reelected, he could never create the never-ending presidency, and actually getting defeated proved to be a gift for him because it unburdened him from politics, which actually constrained him. And he ended up architecting a post-presidential administration where he basically had a constituency of himself. And so he focused on all the things that he liked about being a president and got rid of all the things that he didn't like about being president. He basically creates the never-ending presidency he always wanted. And you go back to the Hamilton quote in Federalist 72 that I mentioned early on. Jimmy Carter represents both the best and most supportive parts of the role that ex-presidents can play, and the most frustrating part of the ex-presidency for their successors. And he's been a bipartisan nuisance to presidents and successors on both sides of the aisle. He's done extraordinary things, right? So as a post-president, he's basically cured the world of guinea worm and advanced an extraordinary health agenda, promoted free and fair elections and human rights around the world, and elevated Habitat for Humanity. He's been he played an incredible role in Panama when Noriega was trying to rig the election for his narco successor. But he's done some extremely frustrating things to his successors as well. So when George H.W. Bush was getting ready and trying to kind of bring the UN Security Council along for a P5 resolution to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, Jimmy Carter decides to write to several members of the Security Council privately and secretly to encourage them to subvert Bush's agenda. James Baker said if there's a violation of the Logan Act, this is it. And then in 1994, when Bill Clinton's facing a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, he sends Jimmy Carter there as a message and makes it very clear he's not to make policy. And then Clinton turns on CNN only to find Jimmy Carter announcing the deal that he's just negotiated for a new nuclear framework with Kim Il-sung. What's interesting about Jimmy Carter, though, is, look, former presidents have real status and they're not accountable to voters, but they're accountable to the court of public opinion. And when Carter wrote Peace, Not Apartheid, I think this showed itself, right? Because he lost a degree of public support that he never fully gained back. And so there is a check and balance on the post-presidency. They're a feature of our democracy. The American people give them their platform. By virtue of how much they revere them and endorse them versus how much they chastise them. And Jimmy Carter, he's experienced it all. So in a lot of respects, he's an executive summary of what the post-presidency has been in our history.
And then number 7, final president, a president that you and I both worked for and admire, President George W. Bush. And I almost think this chapter could be titled The Zen President on some level, because he just really seems at peace with himself and the world and able to leave the power at the front door of the White House in a way that other presidents just haven't been able to do. And you spent 2 days with President Bush during COVID in 2020. And can you talk about some of your conversations and what you learned about President Bush and his post-presidency?
Yeah, so I did. I recorded about 9 hours of interviews with him on the record over 2 days. It's the longest interview he's ever given exclusively about his post-presidency to date. The chapter is called Moving On. It actually took me a while to figure out that that's what the model was. The reason I chose George W. Bush, I knew it would be controversial, and I knew it had the risk of being an Achilles heel because he's such a polarizing figure. So my thesis was, if you look at the active living presidencies, there's only one whose popularity has doubled. And it's a man who's invested less in his legacy and reputation than any of his other active contemporaries. It's a fact-based observation, and I thought that was a good place to start. And I wanted to understand why and unpack that. So in spending time with him, there's sort of an initial explanation, which is he has a genuine reverence for the Washington principle of one president at a time, and he really adheres to it, right? He doesn't just say it and occasionally dip his toe in the water. He's never mentioned his successors by name. He doesn't campaign. He doesn't speak at the conventions. He doesn't weigh in. He's completely separated, and I think that's aged well in the era of Trump, and that's not a partisan comment one way or the other. It's just a fact. Third is, he has advanced an agenda that's not political, but is policy related around a set of issues that Americans remember him fondly for: public health, human rights. And then he's elevated some of the symbols of that by finding a post-presidential voice through painting that allows him to advance those causes without undermining his successors. But to me, the really interesting part of George W. Bush's story, the one that really got me, was the conversation he and I had about legacy. We started talking about legacy, and he said, look, you can't long for what you can't have. When it's over, it's over. I don't miss it. And he's a chapter guy. So he views his life as a chapter. And after his second term as president, he closed the book on the political chapter, and he just completely moved on. And that's not how human beings function. But he's so disciplined that he just is not introspective about it at all. And that bothers his critics to no end, but it's a super interesting thing to dig into. But he finds legacy to be a dirty word and a selfish word. And I think a lot of what guides him is he just is unburdened by the need to influence his legacy. He told me, I read 3 books about George Washington last year. By the time they get around to the other George, meaning him, he's going to be long gone and not around to see their evaluation. And his view about legacies, he quarrels with it. He doesn't understand why somebody would sacrifice the present to achieve something that they're not going to be around to see. And that is a core principle that he abides by. And he's like the most at peace present human being that I think I've ever encountered in my entire life. And he's managed to recalibrate all of his ambition towards, being present. And so when I talk to all of his friends and family and so forth, and they describe a man who is just totally at peace.
It really is an incredible book. And I hope that everyone who watched this Zoom has already bought the book, first of all. And if you haven't, you need to go quickly. by it and enjoy it. And I think it's just so helpful to have the way you modeled it, where you really can just look at each different chapter, separate. You don't have to read them in order even, although I would recommend it. But it's helpful in terms of just gaining perspective from looking at the challenges faced by these great American leaders. So thank you so much for your contribution to American history, Jared.
Thank you, Elise. It's so lovely to do this with you, and I can't wait to read your book on Eisenhower.
Thank you so much.
I was just about to say the same thing, Elise. We're going to look forward to that book as well. I appreciate, I will say in some ways you had an easy job because with Jared, you put the golf ball in the tee and you step back, and you are a fountain, Jared. You have so much data right at your fingertips, so smooth in how you're describing each of these people. I realize you did a lot of research. You've been working on the book for a long time, but your passion for your topic and for these various individuals and for the presidency is so evident. It's utterly fascinating. I really, really appreciate that Dana Susskind brought you to us. I appreciate that she did that. Elise, I really appreciate your time tonight as well for in and above your friendship with Jared. It's really, we appreciate that you helped present him and his content to our audience. We very much appreciate that. In chat, we've been putting various links and things to different pieces that interviews with Jared and different things that have been part of the publicity tour for the book. We also have put in, we're going to do an after hours segment with Jared where you can come and ask your own questions. It's going to start at 8:05 Central, which is in about 8 minutes from now. This Zoom will end right at 8 o'clock. And then we'll give them a 5-minute break, and then we'll open that so you can come join us, come get a copy of the book. I was wondering, Elise, from your point of view, there were no questions submitted, so I don't have a question to pose to you, Jared, from audience. Elise, I'm wondering if you might offer an opinion as to, do you feel like, would you swap out any not that you could probably sign off on all 7, do you wish there was an 8th chapter? Who would you maybe pop in? Who's somebody that perhaps you admire as well?
Well, I find Harry S. Truman's post-presidency to be fascinating. I'm sure Jared does too, but he also has written about Truman extensively previously, so I understand why he probably didn't choose Truman, just because how Truman's own experience changed how we look at what is our responsibility to those public servants who step up to lead. And also, frankly, I'm just fascinated with Truman and his feud with Eisenhower, and how that just was deeply personal. And researching myself, what was that all really about? Because it really went beyond any strictly policy differences. Because Truman, he was a very kind man, but he was a very saucy man too. And it was interesting to watch how he evolved, the decades that he lived, and lived to a fairly old age too, in a time when probably normally wouldn't have. So.
And Jared, maybe just because we are a Chicago-based organization, that we are broadcasting nationally, internationally, for those, Chicago, for those wondering like, well, gee, did you think about Barack Obama? I know when we discussed prior, you had a certain rationale in terms of what you were looking at for post-presidencies. So maybe just for the Chicago audience here, maybe give a word about why you didn't consider Obama for the book.
Yeah. I mean, look, the cop-out answer would be, not to do the last 2 presidents, but the more authentic, and I think that would actually be valid. But the more authentic answer is, look, when I look at Obama's, left office very young at a time where people live much longer, and assuming he has good health, there's a lot of runway, and all the evidence suggests that if you look at the presidents that I wrote about, they all live, a disproportionately long time relative to the life expectancy in Obama's in early innings. And so if I look at those early innings, I don't see the coherence yet in his post-presidency. He still has a lot of popularity. He's not figured out what to do with it. He's in that stage that so many ex-presidents find themselves in, where, you're making money, you're figuring out the foundation, you get a few, you're figuring out what you want it to be, you're organizing your life, you're enjoying some downtime, you're dealing with your successors having kind of undone, some of what you started. And some, I would say most ex-presidents never make it out of that stage, right? What's unique about the 7 that I write about is they all found a greater sense of purpose after the White House, right? That meant that it didn't matter if they were president or something else. It was the pursuit of something purposeful. I don't yet know what that is for Obama. It's not yet illuminated itself. It's not a critique. It's just to say that, he's still stuck in that stage that every ex-president gets stuck in.
And I'm looking at the time too, so I want to make sure we end on time, but he's kind of like not yet a fully formed post-president.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, okay. Elise, thanks so much. Best wishes.
Thanks
Hope
for
we can
having
welcome
me.
you
So
back
much
again
fun.
soon. Keep us in mind when your book comes out. We'd love to
course.
see what's going on with that. Jared, you got about 5-minute break. Everybody, we
Great.
hope to see you at after hours, and thanks
Great.
for joining us today.
Thank you, Elise.
Bye.